How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Lamed Aleph, Daf 31 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, Daf 31 is an awesome daf in my opinion. It is an awesome daf in my opinion. Why is it an awesome daf in my opinion? Because yesterday at the end of the daf, we learned about what happens if a sofer, when writing the Sefer Torah, omits Shem Hashem, omits the name of the Rabbi Shalom. So we saw a whole bunch of solutions from different Tanoim. One of the solutions was from a Tana named R Shimon Shazuri. R Shimon Shazuri had suggested that the Shem Hashem can go in between the lines, can be written. So if you write Vayidaber El Moshe Lemor, you forget to write Hashem. So you put it above the line in the space between the lines. We are going to see a statement today from Ravin Bar Chinina Mishum, somebody in the name of Rabbi Chanina, right? Let's see what it says. Ravin Bar Chinina Amar Ula Amar Rab Chanina. And he says that halacha Reb Shimon Shazuri, that the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shazuri. V'lo oda, not only that, elakol malkum sheshana Reb Shimon Shazuri halacha k'mosa, that whenever Reb Shimon Shazuri teaches something, the halacha is like him. Interesting. The Gemara wants to know, where did Ravin Bar Chinina say this? That when he says the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shazuri, in what context? Was that in our context? Was he referring to our context of Ksiva Sefer Torah? Or maybe it was some other context. And that is what we are going to be focused on today. Reb Shimon Shazuri, and trying to figure out where was the place that Ravin Bar Chinina said that the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shazuri, and not only that, every place where he comes up, the halacha is like him. We are going to see Mishnayos. We're going to learn Mishnayos from all over the Mishnayos spectrum. We're basically going to learn Mishnayos today from like all over Shas. We're going to learn Mishnayos from Chulin, from Gittin, from Demai, from Tyrus, from Kalim, from other brises. We're basically just going to be learning lots of Mishnayos and a few brises today from very different parts of the Torah Shabbat Peh. And there's going to be a lot to discuss. And I think it's interesting because we're going to see a lot of very different things, and we're going to be talking about a lot of different things. We're going to see a lot of different things today, which I think is interesting. But basically, today we're basically learning Mishnayos. Essentially, we're just like kind of like sewing together, piecing together different Mishnayos. Maybe it's this Mishnah, maybe it's that Mishnah. No, it can't be that. Okay, let's try this Mishnah. We're going to be and along the way, we're going to be learning a lot of Mishnayos. So that's basically what's on the agenda. I'm going to stop kind of basically at the top of Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, because after that it gets back into discussing the Sefer Torah, and I think we're probably going to be pretty exhausted after learning all these Mishnayos, and I don't want to just like change topics like that back to Sefer Torah right at the end when everybody's kind of like already in a totally different headspace. So we'll start with that tomorrow, which means that we're going to have Lamed Aleph Amud Beis tomorrow. Anyways, friends, that is what's on the agenda today. Really looking into these different, maybe about 6 or 7 different shitas of Reb Shimon Shazuri in different contexts and learning about them. Friends, that is what we have ahead of us, and that's what we can look forward to on Daf Lamed Aleph of Masechta Menachos. Let's do it. Friends, we begin on Daf Lamed Amud Beis, I'd say about 40% of the way down the Amud. Daf Lamed Amud Beis, about 40% of the way down the Amud. Omar Ravin Bar Chinina, Omar Ula, Omar Rab Chanina, as we read in the introduction, halacha Reb Shimon Shazuri, that the halacha is like Reb Shimon Shazuri. Where? In what context? I don't know. Not only that, elakol makim sheshana Reb Shimon Shazuri halacha kimosa, and whenever Reb Shimon Shazuri teaches something, the halacha will be like him. Interesting. Now, what is this statement of Ravin Bar Chinina? What was said that in response to that, or in response to which Mishnah did Rav and Bar Chinna say the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and it's always like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri. If we're saying that it's on what we learned at the end of the daf yesterday, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer Kol Hashem Kulo Tolin, that you can write the entire. I hope I said this in the introduction. That you can write the entire name of. You can write the name of God between the lines, but you have to. I feel like I may have left out this part. I was listening to yesterday's daf. I feel like I made a mistake. At one point I made a mistake. I said 499 when I was supposed to say 250. I hope I don't know. Maybe I'm losing my marbles. I might be losing my marbles. But anyways, I'm sorry if I made a mistake. In the introduction, I had meant to say what it's saying now, in case I didn't say it, that Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says that you can, what does he say? Kol Hashem kulo tolim, mikzosu ein tolin. That in between the lines, right, if you leave out the Shem Hashem, so then you can fill it in above the line where it was supposed to be, in the margin, above, right, in the space between the lines. But you have to write the entire Shem Hashem. You can't just write part of the name of God, right? Kol Hashem kulo tolin, the entire Shem Hashem you could write in between the lines. Mikzaso ein tolin, not, but you can't do that with only part of the Shem of Hashem. Okay. So if it is on that statement that Rav and Bar Chinna says, and the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and it's always like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri whenever he appears. V'ha'itmar Allah. But it was stated on all of those opinions that we saw. So Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, Kamuvan, Rabbi Meir. So it was stated on that. Omar, also Rabbi Yitzchak, we pass like one of the options says, it was stated, Omar, we saw this yesterday, Omar of Chananel Omar Rav, halacha tolin es Hashem. It says of Chananel Omar Rav that the halacha is that you can put the name in between the lines, like Rabbi Yossi had said. Rabbi Babachana Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel halacha mocheg v'kosev, that you can erase the letter when it's still moist and write Shem Hashem like Rabbi Yitzchak has said. Now, v'im Isa, if Rav and Bar Chinna was going on this machlokes, well, just like Rav Chananel Amar Rav and Rav Bar Chana or Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel had said who the halacha is like, who nami lema, Rav and Bar Chinna should have spoken up then as well and put in his input, which is that the halacha is like Rav Shimon Shazuri. But he didn't, so it would seem that he's not going in that context, because if he was, he should have spoken up when the others did. Okay, so Ela Aha. So if Rav and Bar Chinna is not referring to our machlokes by Ksiva Sefer Torah, then he's referring to the following. Reb Shimon Shazuri Omer says, Reb Shimon Shazuri afilu ben chomei shonim v'chorish b'sodeh shchitas imo mita'aroso. Interesting. What's this talking about? Who can tell me what this is talking about? This is talking about a scenario where an animal is slaughtered. Let's say a cow is slaughtered. And inside of the slaughtered cow is found a unborn baby cow. And this unborn baby cow is 9 months old. I don't know how we determine that, but the baby inside of the slaughtered cow is 9 months old and it is alive. So there's a machlokes in the Mishnah in Chulin. Reb Meir says that this, let's call it a calf, that this calf that was found inside of the mother 9 months, has been developing for 9 months and it's alive. Reb Meir says if you're going to want to eat this calf, you'll have to shecht it. Because the shaila is you already shechted the mother. And when you shechted the mother, this baby was still inside of the mother, it was part of the mother when the mother was shechted. So the shaila is it considered like it already experienced shchita to the extent that if you want to now eat it, you wouldn't have to do shchita. You'd obviously have to kill it somehow, but it wouldn't have to be ritual slaughter. It wouldn't have to be shchita. It already experienced shchita when it was inside of the mother. And therefore, so the shaila is, do you have to shecht it or not? Reb Meir says, yes, you do. Reb Meir says, if you're going to want to eat this baby cow, you're going to have to slaughter it. Kosher shchita. Right, developed the full 9 months. It's alive. if you want to eat it, you're going to have to slaughter it properly. The Chachamim say that you don't have to slaughter it. It was inside of the mother when the mother was slaughtered, and therefore it already experienced shchita. Obviously, you have to kill it somehow. I imagine, unless there's no Ever Menachai. I wonder. I don't know what the answer to that is. But you don't have to do shchita. However, the Chachamim do say though that if the animal kind of starts walking and walks around, and all of a sudden now can be confused with any other animal that is now walking around. So, meaning even if you know which one it is, but Kilu, once it starts walking around, at that point, the Chacham do say that even though in principle, when it was inside of its mother and the mother was slaughtered, it was kind of slaughtered and doesn't need to be slaughtered anymore. However, once it starts walking around like all the other animals walk around, it would be weird if you just like shoot it in the head and eat it. So they say that once it starts walking around, you have to shecht it, even if technically speaking you don't, because it was already shechted, so to speak, but you will have to shecht it once it starts walking around. And here comes the opinion of Shimon Shazuri, who says, again, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, Omer says Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, afilu ben chomesh shonim. He says, no, even if this cow is now 5 years old, v'choresh basodeh, and it's plowing in the field. I mean, it seems like just a regular cow. Shchitas imo mitaraso. It still does not need to be slaughtered because it was already slaughtered when it was inside of it. Right? Shchitas imo mitaraso. The slaughter of its mother is mitaret kilu. It doesn't need to be slaughtered any more. That is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Shazuri. So if it is on that halacha, if it is on that opinion of Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, but v'ha itmarla, it was stated on that Mishnah, Omer Zeiri, Omer Chanina, halacha Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, that Zeiri says the name of Rabbi Chanina, that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, v'im isa human huna milema. And if Ravin Bar Chanina was referring to that Mishnah, so when Zeiri says in the name of Rabbi Chanina that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, Ravin Bar Chanina should have joined together with that statement as well and participated in that statement as well, but he didn't. So it must be that he's referring to a different statement of Rav Shimon Shazuri. Ela aha, rather on the following opinion of Rav Shimon Shazuri. Barishona yu omrim hayotze bakoler ve'omer kisvu get leishti hare elu yichtavu v'yitnu chazulomer af ha-mefarish v'ayotze b'shayara. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri omer af ha-mesukin. This is a Mishnah in Masechta Gittin, and it discusses that in general, if a husband says to two people, write a get for my wife, it means just that. Write a get for my wife. Don't give it to her, but write it for her. However, if a person is being dragged away by the authorities, quite possibly never to be seen again, and he says, write a get to my wife, that means write a get to my wife and give it to her. We don't know if we're ever going to see this person again. We're not waiting for a separate, and now give it to her. What he's saying is, this may be the last time you ever see me alive. Write a get to my wife and give it to her so that she doesn't have to worry about Yibum. So why didn't he say and give it to her? Because he was flustered. Because he was being dragged out by the authorities, quite likely never to be seen again, or even definitely never to be seen again. He was a little flustered. He forgot to say and give it to her. But when he said, write a get to my wife, what it meant is, you're probably never going to see me again. I'm probably never going to see my wife again. I don't want her to have to deal with Yibum. Write a get to my wife and give it to her so that she's a divorcee rather than a widow and she doesn't have to worry about Yibum. Now, so again, Ela Aho. Barishona yu omrim. Initially they would say Ayotze Bakoler, that somebody who's being taken out. I think Rashi says here Davka to be killed. He's being taken out mamish to be killed. I think there's different opinions on that, but whatever it is, it's mamish a modna dikazach. It's a bad situation. But it says Rashi here, his mamish is being taken out to be killed. And he says, "Va'amar kisvu get liishti." He says, "Write a get to my wife." It means write it and give it. So they write it and they give it. And then they said, the same applies to somebody who's going out to a trip at the sea, and he says, write a get to my wife. Also, it means that it's a potentially dangerous trip, and he's saying, write it and give it. Also, you may never see me again kind of thing. Also, somebody's going on a very dangerous journey by land, but also if he says write a get, it means write a get and give it. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer Afa Mesukin, and Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says, and also somebody who is very, very ill. Somebody who's very, very ill and says write a get to my wife, it means write a get to my wife and give it to her. Inam. Okay, so that's one scenario where Ravin Bar Chinina can be saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri. Inami, alternatively, on the following case, Trumas Meiser shel Demai shechazu limkom Reb Shimon Shazuri Omer Av b'chol sho'alo ve'ochlo al piv. Friends, what's this talking about? This one's a little bit complex. So there's a lot of parts to this. This is a Mishnah in Demai, in Masechta Demai. And what the Mishnah says in Masechta Demai is that if you have Shimon, and Shimon buys produce from Ruvain, the Am Haaretz produce monger. Ruvain, the famous Am Haaretz produce monger. And Shimon buys produce from Ruvain. And when he buys the produce, what does he have to do? Of course, but when it comes to Demai, as we know, Shimon needs to separate Meiser, right? Of course, Am Haaretzes are not chashudin on Truma. When it comes to Truma, Am Haaretzes separate Truma because they know that Truma has a chiyuv. If you eat Truma, it's a chiyuv. It's a zar who eats Truma. It's a chiyuv misa. They know, misa b'dei shamayim. They know it's a very serious thing, and they separate Truma. After all, it's only 2% anyways. Meiser, however, a non-Levi, right? And Meiser goes to a Levi. So, however, a non-Levi is allowed to eat Meiser, and they treat it more leniently. Now, of course, in Meiser, there's also Trumas Meiser, which is actually true, Truma Midora, has the status of Truma. So, you have to be careful with that, and we'll get to that. We'll get there. But anyways, the Am Haaretzes, they're suspicious. We suspect them. They're suspected when it comes to Meiser. It's 10% of the produce, and the Gemara in Sota at the end of Masechta Sota says that Yochanan Kohen Gadol, he went on a shpatzir, went on a tiyul around Eretz Yisrael, and he found that there was reason to be concerned that the Am Haaretzes were not separating Meiser. So Yochanan Kohen Gadol was koveya that when Shimon purchases his produce from Ruvain, the famous Am Haaretz produce monger, Shimon then needs to separate Meiser. Now what happens? Shimon purchases produce from Ruvain, and now it's Shabbos. And he wants to make a salad. And he says, wait a second, but I didn't separate Meiser from this Demai. Now, of course, this isn't Tevel, it's Demai, right? We don't know for sure that it needs to be tied, but it's possible. It might need to be tied. Also remember, we often say, although we'll see it'll come up a little bit at the end of today's daf, the concept of Rov Amei Haaretz Me'asrneim, that we often say that most Am Haaretzes even do actually separate Meiser, just some of them don't. Now, so it's Shabbos, and Shimon realizes that he didn't yet separate Meiser. Now, you're not allowed to separate Trumas and Meisers on Shabbos because it's Misakin. You're fixing the produce. So you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. So he's a shtickle stuck. But what about Oynik Shabbos? He wants to have a Geshmaka salad for a Shabbos Suda. So what he can do is, and special because it's Shabbos and he's not allowed to separate Meisers on Shabbos, he can go, he knows where Ruvain lives. He knows where Reuven lives. They live in the same area. He knows Reuven. He knows where he lives. He can go to Reuven's house, knock on the door, and say, Reuven, did you separate Meiser from the produce that I bought? Normally, obviously, of course, as we're going to learn in the Mishnayos and Masechta Bechoros, that normally somebody who is suspect about something is not trusted to testify about that thing. But this is because we want Shimon to be able to enjoy his salad on Shabbos, and anyways, we're talking about Demai, Rov Amiaretz, Masrin, whatever. The Mishnah says here, Shimon can go to Reuven's house, knock on his door while he's in the middle of the Shabbos nap, and ask Reuven, did you separate Maisris from the produce? And if he says, I did, that is good enough for Shimon to be able to go back home and make a salad with this produce. And then immediately after Shabbos, he cannot eat any more of the produce until he separates Maisris. This is a special dispensation for Shabbos, that we say that he could simply ask Reuven if he separated Maisris or not. Comes Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, and he says, and he takes it kind of one step further, or kind of expands this principle. And he says that if, when Shimon, even during the week, not just on Shabbos, even during the week, if when Shimon is separating Trumas Meiser, now what's Trumas Meiser? Trumas Meiser is that, so first of all, how does the whole separating Meiser from Demai work? How does the whole separating Meiser from Demai work? As we said, Shimon doesn't need to separate Truma. Reuben already separated Truma. Shimon just needs to separate Meiser. So Shimon separates Meiser from the produce, right? Forget about, we're not talking about Shabbos anymore. We're talking about Shimon purchased produce from Reuven, and he goes home, and now he's separating Meiser. How does that work? So, well, he separates Meiser. What does he do with the Meiser? You might be thinking he gives it to the Levi. He doesn't give it to the Levi. Why does he not give it to the Levi? Well, because, first of all, Shimon, who's not a Levi, is technically allowed to eat Meiser. And this is not Tevel. If it was Tevel, it was certainly untied. So yeah, you separate Meiser and you give it to Levi. But, if we, let's say, Rov Amearetz Me'asrim, chances are that actually this was already tied, then it's just a just-in-case kind of situation. But at the very least, even if you don't say Rov Amearetz Me'asrim, we don't know for sure that it's Tevel. It's Demai, we don't know what it is. So if Levi comes to Reuven, if Levi the Levi comes to Shimon and says, Shimon, I know that you just bought Demai from Reuven, give me the Meiser. Shimon says to Levi the Levi, prove that Reuven didn't separate Meiser already. You don't know that, Levi the Levi. You don't know that Reuven didn't already separate Meiser. Therefore, Amotzi Mechaveru Olav Araya, if Levi wants to say to Shimon, give me the Meiser, Levi needs to prove to Shimon that Reuven never separated Meiser. And assuming that Levi can't prove that, well, Shimon, who's allowed to technically eat Meiser, says, well, I'm keeping it for myself because if Reuven did in fact already separate Meiser, this is not Meiser. This is just Chulin, and I'm keeping it for myself, and I'm going to eat it. However, Shimon does need to separate Trumas Meiser, which means that 10% of the Meiser that he just separated, that goes to the Kohen. And Trumas Meiser has a status of Meiser. No, Trumas Meiser has a status of Truma. Mamish Truma. That it needs to go to the Kohen, and a Zar who eats Trumas Meiser, is Chayiv Misa B'dei Shamayim. Mamish has a status of Truma, and that needs to go to the Kohen. Now, what happens if that Trumas Meiser that Shimon separates from this Demai falls into a whole bunch of Chulin that he has? If the Trumas Meiser, which is effectively Truma, falls into a whole bunch of Chulin that Shimon has, that's what's called Meduma. It's now a mixture of Truma and Chulin. And it's usher to a Zar, to a non-Kohen. If there are 100 parts of Chulin to one part of truma, or in this case trumas meiser, well then the 100 parts of chulin will be mevatel the 1 part of truma. However, if there aren't 100 times 100 parts chulin to truma, well then the whole mixture is what's called meduma, and it's going to be also to Shimon. So now here's where Rabbi Shimon Shazuri comes in. So Shimon had brought produce from Reuven, the famous Amaretz produce monger, and Shimon comes home with the produce, and he says, okay, I have to separate Meiser. He separates Meiser. He then separates Trumas Meiser. The Trumas Meiser gets mixed in with a whole bunch of chulin that he has, and he says, now what? I'm going to lose all this chulin. So says Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, because we're talking about Demai, because this Trumas Meiser isn't definitely Trumas Meiser, it might be Trumas Meiser, it might be chulin. So out of concern and in the interest of preserving Shimon's mixture and not saying, Shimon, you lost your mixture, we say Shimon can go to Reuven and say, hey, Reuven, even during the week, this isn't just a Shabbos dispensation, even during the week, Shimon can go to Reuven and he could say, Reuven, did you separate Meiser from the produce? And if Reuven says, I did, Shimon can salvage his mixture that what he was considering to be Trumas Meiser fell into. We could go based on Reuven that he had already separated Meiser, and there was actually nothing special about that Trumas Meiser. It was all just chulin, and the mixture is in fact permitted. Okay. So again, inami aho Trumas Meiser shel Demai, that when it comes to this Trumas Meiser that Shimon had separated, this Trumas Meiser of Demai, Shechazro Limkoma, that got mixed together with Chulin. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says that because we're talking about Trumas Meiser of Demai, and in the interest, right, not 100% Trumas Meiser, but Suffolk Trumas Meiser, and in the interest of being able to salvage this mixture, that even during the week, Shimon can ask Reuven if Reuven had separated Meiser, and if he says yes, then Shimon can consider the whole mixture to be chulin. But it was stated about it, Rabbi Yechanan, says Rabbi Yechanan, halacha Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri b'mesukin u'v'trumas meiser shel demai. In these two cases, by the mesukin, by the person who's sick and says, write a get to my wife, and by trumas meiser of demai that falls into the mixture, that in both of those cases, says Rabbi Yochanan, that we pass like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, v'im isa, and once again, if it was so that it was on these scenarios that Ravin Bar Chinana says that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, hu nami lema, he should have also said, just like Rabbi Yochanan did, he should have also said that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, but he didn't. Elo aho, rather it's on the following. This is not a Mishnah, this is a Brisa, or I think more accurately a Tosefta. Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur Omer, says Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur Mishum, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri. Pula Mitzri. Pula Mitzri is a type of legume that you can eat its legumes, but another purpose is that you can eat its leaves. Now the thing is that a plant like this, in terms of truma, there are nafkaminas about if the plant is to eat the leaves or if the plant is to eat the beans. If the plant is to eat the leaves, well then it'll be considered like a yerek, like a vegetable. And if it's considered like a yerek, well then in terms of truma, it goes based on when it is harvested. Meaning, as the first Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah says, that on the first of Tishrei, it's a Rosh Hashanah for a few things, including Yerakis. That on the first of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, it is also the Rosh Hashanah for vegetables. Meaning that if you have a group of vegetables that were harvested last year, and a group of vegetables that were harvested this year, well, the Trumas and Meiseris for this year's crop needs to come from this year's crop. And the Trumas and Maisus from last year's crop need to come from last year's crop. Now, when it comes to Yerek, it is defined based, so based on when it is harvested, we define which year they are considered part of. If it was harvested before Rosh Hashanah, it's considered last year's crop. If it was harvested after Rosh Hashanah, it's considered this year's crop. However, if they are legumes, if they are zra'im, if they were planted to be legumes, well then it goes based on when they took root. If the plant took root before Rosh Hashanah, so then it is considered last year's crop. If it took root after Rosh Hashanah, it is considered this year's crop. And again, you can only separate Trumas and Maisuis from for this year's crop, Trumas and Maisuis have to come from this year's crop. And for last year's crop, Trumas and Maisuis need to come from last year's crop. You can't separate from last year's crop for this year's crop and vice versa. Now, Rabbi Yossi ben Kippur Omer Mishum R Shimon Shazuri Pul Amitzri, when it comes to this plant, Shezra'o Lizera, that was planted for the beans, for its legumes. So that means that the year that it's connected to, it's considered part of, is based on when it took root. Now, there was a whole bunch of Pula Mitzri that was planted. Miktsaso ishish lifnei Rosh Hashanah. Some of the crop took root before Rosh Hashanah and are considered part of last year's crop. Miktsaso achar Rosh Hashanah. And another group of the crops took root after Rosh Hashanah and are considered part of this year's crop. Ein tormin mize alze. So you can't separate Trumas and Maisuis from last year's crop in order to be motzi this year's crop from Tevel and to say that it's chulin. Ein tormin uma'asin lo min achodosh ala yoshon, because we don't separate Trumas and Maisuis from this year's crop in order to make last year's crop chulin, in order to be matir last year's crop. V'lo min hayoshen ala chodosh, and we don't separate Trumas and Maisuis from last year's crop in order to permit this year's crop. Ketzad Yaisa. So what do? You have this whole crop of plants. Some of them are from last year's crop, some of them from this year's crop. What do? What you do is, Sover Gorno Lisocho, what you do is, you take all of the crops, you bring them together, you mix them up real good, so that statistically speaking, if you take a sample from the mixture, it will contain equal parts of both mixture, assuming that let's say there are 100 crops from this year, 100 crops from last year, but whatever it is, the sample will represent the components of the mixture. Let's say it's 50-50, fine. So let's just say that there were 100 crops from this year and 100 crops from last year, so that means that there's a total of 200 crops, which means that, let's say, Trumas and Maisuis are around 20 crops, let's say, whatever it is, without getting into details, 20 crops. So when he separates those 20 crops from the total of 200 crops, and 100 of them were from this year, 100 of them for last year, well, statistically speaking, 100, I think that's how to understand it, that 100 of them will be for this year and be motzi the 100 crops from this year. 10 of them will be from this year and will be motzi, will be matir the 100 crops from this year, and 10 of them will be from last year and will be motzi last year's crop, will be matir last year's crop, all good. But again, it was stated, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, Rabbi Yochanan, halacha Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, that the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, v'im Isa, and again, if Rav bar Chinina was going on this brayse, Hunami lema, well then Rav bar Chinina should have said it here as well, just like Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani had said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. El Omer Papa, Ashida, Rav Nachman Yitzchak Omer Ayayin. Rather, what the statement of Rav and Bar Chinina was going on was on, says Rav Papa, that he was going on a shida. Okay, Rav Nachman Yitzchak Omar Ayayin, that it's going on yayin. Okay, we're going to learn two more mishnayos one from Masechta Kelim and one from Masechta Tyrus. Rav Papa Omer says, Rav Papa, Ashida. What is this Shida? That is a great question. That is a great question. We will see what a Shida is in a minute. The Tanan, as we learn in the Mishnah, Masechta Kelim, Hashida Beishamei Omrim, Nimdedes mi befnim v'esil Omrim mi bachutz umodim elu va'elu shein ovi haraglaim v'ovi levizbezin nimdod. Oh, I forgot to do that. Oh, dang it. Okay, maybe I'll have to do that now. 1 second. Okay. Rabbi Yossi Omer modim sha'ovi haraglaim v'ovi levizbezin nimdod uveneim ein nimdod. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer moyu raglaim gvos tepach ein beneim nimdod v'imlav beneim nimdod. Sheesh. Okay, 1 second. I have an image here. I forgot to add arrows to it. I'm going to add arrows to it. I will be right back. All right. I just added some arrows to this image that I have here. Okay. What is this image that I have here? That is a very, very, very great question. Now, okay. What is going on here? This is a Mishnah from Masechta Kelim. Now, I learned this Mishnah yesterday, and I said, I need to see what this looks like. I didn't know what all I had was the Kati Mishnayos. The art school didn't have any images. I said, I need to see what this looks like. I'm going to be learning Masechta Kelim Mishnayos in a few months. I had a feeling that I was probably going to need some kind of visuals over here to look like something. So I said, I need to see what this looks like. Anyways, so I went to the Sfarim store. I went down to Geula area to Girsa Sfarim by Zichron Moshe, and I bought a sefer. This is an incredible sefer. It's unbelievable. It's hand-drawn drawings from Masechta Kelim. Every single Mishnah has like tons of drawings. I went there expecting to buy some kind of like art scroll book or something. I went directly to the art scroll Mishnayos to see if they had diagrams, and they didn't have diagrams. I wanted to see what this looked like, so I asked the guy. I said, "Could you recommend me a book from Masechta Kelim that has visuals so I could see what things look like?" He said, "Here's this. Go here. He said, look over here." He knew exactly where the book was. He said shelf 40, all the way at the bottom, and here it is. I was and still am blown away. These are all hand-drawn drawings, and there is no way I could have ever imagined that this is what it was talking about. By the way, this is apparently how the Rambam learns it. Rashi, it came up in Masechta Shabbos. I remember, you see how there's a wheel there? I didn't point to the wheel, but at the bottom left is like a wheel. It seems like this is some kind of a cart that has a wheel that you can like kind of move around, and then you can also stand it up. You see where the white arrow is pointing to, there's some kind of a leg. I would have never imagined this is what he's talking about. And guess what? When we learned Masechta Shabbos, there's no way I was imagining something like this. Rashi's version is a little bit different. It's more of like a carriage for somebody to go in. But still, I mean, this is very detailed. Okay. So, now here's the next thing. So, I tried to understand this Mishnah with the Kahati, with the art scroll Gemara. I freaking bought pictures. I looked at a English translation of Sefaria. I read Rashi, of course. I still can't say for sure that I understand the Mishnah. I put a lot of effort into it. I can't say for sure I understand it, but I will explain it how I can. Before I can explain it, we need to talk. When it comes to wooden vessels and being Mekabel Tumah, the Pasuk says, I'm going to read you a Pasuk from Parashat Shmini. V'chol asher yipol olav meim b'mosam is talking about sheretzes, that anything that a sheretz falls on when it's dead. Mikol kli eitz, whether it's wood, o beged, or garments, o or hide, o sak, or a sack. And I think the sack is probably the most important one here. Kol kli asher ye'oseh melacha boim b'mayim yuva v'tomei ha'arav v'tar. When it comes to tumas, the tumah of wood, and we talked about this a little bit the other day with the shulchan, when we had said that we had thought that to consider the shulchan to be a kliya acher asul lenachis, a vessel that is meant to be stationary and therefore should not be makabel tumah. What is this talking about? Well, as we just read in the verse, in the pasuk, wood is grouped together with sock, with sackcloth. Now, with a sack of sorts. So now a sack is something, imagine like a knapsack. So a knapsack is something that, of course, you can carry when it is empty. And you can also carry it when it is full. You fill up the backpack with books and things. You fill it up and you can carry it. You carry it when it's empty. You carry it when it's full. That is a criteria for a sack to be mikabel tumah. It has to have a base kibul. It has to be able to hold things. And it has to be able to be held when it is full. And the same applies to wood. Wood is in that same pasuk. Therefore, we of course have the concept that pshute klei are not mikabel tumah. If you have just like a plank of wood, it's not mikabel tumah because it can't receive anything. It doesn't have a base kibul like a sack has. But if you have, let's say, a bowl, a wooden bowl, and it can receive things, it has a base kibul, and you could fill it up with whatever you want and pick it up. Fill it up with soup, fill it up with rice, fill it up with whatever you want, and you could pick it up, you could put it down, you can move it around. It has a base kibul, so that wooden bowl will be makabel tumah. However, if the wooden utensil can hold 40 sa'ah of water, well then that's already going to be considered a vessel that cannot be lifted when it's full. Right? It can't be moved mole v'reikon when it's empty, but also when it's full. And what's the size of that vessel that can hold 40 sa'ah of water? It's 1 amma by 1 amma at a height of 3 ammas. So basically, if you have a vessel that is 1 amma by 1 amma at a height of 3 ammas, so then it's considered that you can fit 40 sa'ah of water in it, and which means that when you fill it up with 40 sa'ah of water, you won't be able to lift it, it will be too heavy. And because this is a vessel that can't be lifted when it is full, so therefore it is not mikabel tumah. That was from the chapter, from Perek Tesvav Mishnah Aleph of Masechta Kelim. The Mishnah that we are learning here is Perek Yud Ches Mishnah Aleph of Masechta Kelim. And now, with that introduction, let us have a look at our Mishnah. The Tanam we learn in a Mishnah. Hashida, this thing, I don't even know what to call it. It's a thing. Some kind of a container that can hold 40 sa'ah, I guess, of water, potentially. That's what we're trying to figure out, how big it is. But it's some kind of a container, okay? And it's got like space on the bottom and legs and walls and all sorts of things. Beis Shammai almost says, Beis Shammai, I could have never imagined all the details in this Mishnah without this artist rendering. It's amazing how like still the best sefer is some person who just like drew these things with pen and paper. I don't know how he know that this is what these things look like. Who told him? But I don't know. How would I have ever figured this out? Anyways, nimdedes mi bifnim. So according to Beis Shammai, in order to measure if this is 1 amma by 1 amma at a height of 3 ammas, so the measurements would be measured from the inside of the container. Beis Hillel says you can even include in the measurements the thickness of the walls of the container as well. So not just the internal space, but also but the external space, including the walls. Umodim elu ve'elu she'ein ovi araglayim v'ovi alivizbezin nimdar. However, Beis Hillel would agree with Beis Shammai that the width of the legs, the white arrow that I have there, the white arrow is pointing, you could see on the bottom to like a leg, that like a peg of sorts that this container is like resting on, right? It's got a wheel on one end and some kind of a peg on the other to stand on. And Rashi says that peg was actually a bit wider than the vessel itself. Okay, so whatever this leg that it had, I guess, stuck out a little bit from the it wasn't flat flush against the side. It stuck out a little bit. I hope that I explained that well enough. If you took your hand, for example, and went down the side of the wall of the container, when you got to the leg, your hand would stop because it was sticking out. The fact that the leg sticks out from the bottom of the container is irrelevant. That's not part of the measurements. in order to see if it's considered big enough so that it would not be makabel tuma. And also the levizbezin, which the pink arrow is pointing to, which is some kind of a lip to the container, that also is excluded from the measurements. Beis Hillel would agree with that. Okay, fine. Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi, modim, so the shaila is, who is modim? But okay. She'ovi araglayim ve'ovi alevizbezin nimdad. So they admit, so it's interesting because we're saying they admit that she'ovi araglayim ve'ovi alevizbezin nimdad uveneim einam nimdad. So mistama, it's not talking about Beis Shammai, because Beis Shammai, it's a shaila. Either Rabbi Yossi disagrees with what Beis Shammai's opinion is, or let's just say it's talking about Beis Hillel. It's a little bit easier that way. So let's say that Rabbi Yossi is talking about Beis Hillel. So Rabbi Yossi Omer says Rabbi Yossi, modim that Beis Hillel, so he disagrees, and he says that Beis Hillel says she'ovi raglayim, that the where the legs stick out from the container, ve'ovi alevizbezin, and this lip that's pointed to by the pink arrow that sticks out from the container, nimdad, they are actually measured in terms of the 1 amma by 1 amma measurement. Uveneyen, however, underneath the container where the blue arrow is pointing to, right, because there's a space underneath the container, right? I hope I understand this correctly. It's very difficult to understand. I've read like 5 different versions of this Mishnah to try to understand it. I hope I understand it correctly. So if you notice, right at the bottom, there's like a wheel, and then there's like a peg, and there's some space between the bottom of the container and the floor and the ground. So uveneim ein nimdad. So that height is excluded. So when we're talking about 1 amma by 1 amma at a height of 3 amos, so can you include the space beneath the container, between the bottom of the container and the ground? So it says Rabbi Yossi that Beis Hillel says that cannot be included in the measurements. So you can include the leg that sticks out, you can include this levizbezin that sticks out in terms of the 1 amma by 1 amma, but in terms of the height, you wouldn't be able to include the area underneath the container. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer now says, Rabbi Shimon Shazuri, im hayu raglayim givos tefach, if the legs were a tefach or more off the ground, well then, ein beinein nimdad. You cannot count the space between the bottom of the container and the ground. Ve'im lav, but if they're less than a tefach, nimdad ve'im lav beinein nimdad. But if the leg that's being pointed to by the right arrow is less than a tefach, well then, the height beneath the container and between the bottom of the container and the ground can be included in the height to determine if it is 1 amma by 1 amma at a height of 3 ammas. And if it is, it will be considered big enough that it will be unable to be held when it is filled, and that it will not be makabel tuma. Okay, that was that Mishnah. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says it's talking about wine. Ditnan, that we learned in the Mishnah in Masechta Tyrus, related to actually what we learned all the way back 6 years ago in Masechta Brachis. Reb Meir Omer says, Reb Meir, Shemen Tchila Le'olam, V'chacham Omer Afa Dvash, Reb Shimon Shazuri Omer Afa Yaim. So says Reb Meir that Shemen is a Tchila. If you remember, we learned in Masechta Brachis, in chapter 8 of Masechta Brachis, we learned, I didn't look up if it actually says this there, but if not, then it's this principle that Kol HaPosel Es HaTruma, what's it called? Posel Es HaTruma, Metamen Es HaMashkin Lios Tchila, or something like that. That water, midirabanan, if it becomes tamei, it becomes midirabanan a rishon l'tuma to be metame ochlin. So says Reb Meir, honey is always going to be a rishon l'tuma, either midoraisa or midirabanan. Meaning that if you have, let's say, a zav who's an avatuma who touches honey, so the honey becomes a rishon l'tuma, midoraisa, and it'll be metame ochlin umashkin. Now, if a rishon latuma or even a sheni latuma touches the mashkin, it will be a rishon. It will be a rishon l'tumah as well. So meaning, normally if a rishon l'tumah touches ochlin umashkin, so they become a sheni l'tumah. However, midrabanan, if a rishon l'tumah touches honey, it does not become a sheni l'tumah. It remains. It now becomes tamei as a rishon l'tumah midrabanan, and it can be mitame ochlin umashkin. And even if a sheni l'tumah, which could usually only be mitame / posel truma or be mitame kodshim, if it touches liquids, normally ochlin umashkin cannot be mitame other ochlin umashkin, but midar rabbanon, they say that it becomes a tchila. It's considered midar rabbanon to be a rishon l'tumah. It can be mitame ochlin umashkin. Okay, so now says the Mishnah. Ditnan Rabbi Meir Omer, says Rabbi Meir, shemen tchila leolam, that oil is oil. I was saying honey, but it doesn't matter. Okay, Rabbi Meir says oil because the Chacham say honey. Fine. Rabbi Meir says oil will always be a tchila. It will always be essentially a rishon l'tumah, whether midoraisa midorabanan. If an avatuma touches it, it's a rishon l'tumah. If a rishon or a sheni l'tumah touch it, it's also a rishon l'tumah midorabanan. So it's always going to be a tchila, which is essentially a rishon, I believe. But I think maybe it's referred to as tchila when we're talking about midorabanan. I haven't yet learned Masechta Tyrus, but soon, within the next probably year or so, hopefully I'll be learning Masechta Tyrus. The Chacham Omim Af Advash, and the Chacham say honey has the same thing. Also honey has the same thing. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer Af Ayayin. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says even wine. Kama Sovar Yayin Lo. 1 second. Wouldn't everybody agree that wine would fall into this category of always becoming a rishon l'tumah, whether midoraisa or whether midorabanan? So Emar Rabbi Shimon Shazuri Omer Yain. So rather say Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says wine, kilu, only wine. Rabbi Meir says oil. The Chacham say honey, even honey. Rabbi Shimon Shazuri says only wine, not oil, not honey. And it is on these Mishnayos, Rav Papa says the Shida, Rav Shimon Rav Nachman, was Rav Nachman or Nachman Bar Yitzchak? Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says the wine, that it is on these statements of Rav Shimon Shazuri that Ravin Bar Chinana is going on when he says that the halacha is like Rav Shimon Shazuri, and that the halacha is always like Rav Shimon Shazuri. Tanya, we learn in Abraise, Reb Shimon Shazuri says, Reb Shimon Shazuri, Pam achas nis'arev li tevel b'chulin. One time, tevel got mixed together with chulin. I had a kilo of tevel wheat, and it got mixed together with 2 kilos of chulin wheat. Uvasi v'sha'alti es Reb Tarfin, for example. And I went and I asked Reb Tarfin, what do I do? V'amarli, and he says to me, Leich kach licha min hashuk v'aser alav, go and buy yourself some wheat from the market, from an Amma Aretz, and separate Meiser, Trumas and Meisers from that, or I guess it's Amma Aretz, technically Meiser. Kasover, or I guess maybe it would be Trumas and Meiser, since you want to be pote the tevel like I'm mixing. Kasover the oraisa beruba bottle, because mida oraisa the 1 kilo of wheat should be bottled to the 2 kilos of chulin. From Ame Aretz ma'aser mein, and most Ame Aretzes are ma'aser. Babble kitorim min apoter al apoter will be like you're being torn from poter al apoter. Chaver, did you get that? So what happened here? Chaver, we learned in Masechta Avodah Zarah. We learned in Masechta Avodah Zarah and Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis that when it comes there, this was I think Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish I think said, and Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis of Masechta Avodah Zarah, they had said that whether we're talking about min b'mino, whether we're talking about min b'she'eno mino, it is oser b'nosein tam. There are 2 exceptions, and that is when it comes to Yei Nesech and when it comes to Tevel. When it comes to Yei Nesech and when it comes to Tevel, Bimino, They're oser b'mino b'mashu. So now, technically speaking, mida oraisa, the 1 kilo of wheat being mixed together with the 2 kilos of chulin, mida oraisa, the 1 kilo of wheat that is tevel, that gets mixed in with the 2 kilos of wheat that's chulin, the 1 kilo of wheat should be bottle mida oraisa. But mida rabbanon, we say that it is osir, that the tevel is osir b'mashu, and therefore this mixture is osir, and you have to separate you have to separate trumas and maasros from the tevel. However, that is only mida rabbanon. Mida oraisa is potter. Now here's the thing: how are you going to separate trumas and maasros from this tevel? Right? You can't just say, okay, it's 1 kilo, so I have to separate, I don't know, 1/10 of a kilo or something, whatever it is, trumas and maasros, because that's going to have chulin mixed in with it, and you can't separate from chulin to be matir tevel. So what do? So what you could do is, so the suggestion of Reb Tarfon was, so you have this mixture, you have the tevel mixed into this mixture, it's a mess. You can't eat the mixture right now. You're going to have to separate trumas and maasros from the tevel, but how do you do it? Because it's all mixed together with the chulin. So what you do is, Reb Tarfon suggests, go to an Amma Oretz, let's say, imagine if he was living in the same generation as Ruvain, the famous Amma Oretz produce monger. So Reb Tarfon says, no, go visit Ruvain and buy some produce, buy some wheat. Buy some wheat from Ruvain. And because, right, Rov Ami Oretz Me'asrunin, really, right, technically we can assume that he already separated Trumas and Maasros, and therefore it should be potter from separating Trumas and Maasros. But as a Chumrah, we say, right, Midrabanan, we say that you do have to separate Trumas and Maasros, but Mida Oraisa, it's potter. So now, essentially what you have is, you have the 1 kilo of wheat that is tevel, but it got mixed together with 2 kilos of wheat that's chulin. Mida Oraisa, the tevel should be bottled to the chulin, and you should not have to separate Trumas and Maasros. So Mida Oraisa, it's potter, but Mida Rabbanan, we say that the tevel is oser b'mashu, and you have to separate trumas and maasros. You can't eat this mixture. And now go and buy produce from an Amma Oretz, which also Mida Oraisa will say Rov Ami Oretz Ma'asrunim. We can assume that it is permitted, and it's potter Mida Oraisa also. But Mida Rabbanan, the rabbis say, separate meiser. So again, we have 2 things that Mida Oraisa are potter from Trumas and Maasros. And now that you have 2 things that are potter from Trumas and Maasros, you can separate Trumas and Maasros from the produce that you bought from the Amma Oretz and take out enough that, an extra 1/10 of a kilo, whatever it is, and like that you'll be separating Trumas and Maasros from potter for potter, because you're not allowed to separate Trumas and Maasros for something chayav for something potter, for something potter for something chayav. But now you have 2 things that midoraisa are potter from Trumas and Maasros, and midorabanan we say you have to separate. And now you can separate Trumas and Maasros from the demai that you bought, and it will be potter, it will be matir, the tevel that got mixed in with the chulin, and that is how you could remedy the situation. So again, I'm going to read from the beginning. Tanya, R Shimon Shazuri says, R Shimon Shazuri, Pam Achas, one time, this Arivli Tevel B'chulin, I had 1 kilo of Tevel wheat that got mixed together with 2 kilos of chulin wheat. Uvasi v'shaltis Reb Tarfon, so I asked Reb Tarfon, what do I do? V'amrli, he says, Leich kach l'cha min hashuk, go to Ruvain, the famous Amma Oretz produce monger, and buy some wheat from him, ve'aser alav, and separate Trumas and Maasros from the wheat that you buy from Ruvain, and separate enough to also account for the kilo of tevel wheat that got mixed in with the 2 kilos of chulin wheat. Because Reb Tarfon kasav the oraisa beruba bottle, that mida oraisa, the 1 kilo of tevel wheat should be bottled to the 2 kilos of chulin wheat. And additionally, V'rov Amei Haaretz Ma'aser Mein, and most Amaretzes do in fact separate Meiser. V'Havale Kitorim Min HaPoter, and therefore it would be considered when he separates Trumas and Meisers from what he purchased from Ruvain, that he would be separating from something that is Poter ala Poter for the Tevel that got mixed in with the Chulin, which is also Poter because Midoraisa is Batal Barov. Two things that Midoraisa are Poter, and you could separate from one Poter thing for another Poter thing. The Gemara asks, why doesn't Reb Tarfon suggest that Reb Shimon Shazuri go buy from an Ovid Kochavim, that if an Ovid Kochavim had purchased land in Eretz Yisrael, so the shaila is, if it's considered midoraisa potter from, right, if an Ovid Kochavim purchases land in Eretz Yisrael, and if it's considered midoraisa potter from Trumas and Meisers, but midorabanan they say to separate it, so that could also be a good solution. Well, because kasaver ain't kinilo Ovid Kochavim Eretz Yisrael lafkia miyad Meiser v'avalei min achiyuv. Well, Reb Tarfon holds that when an Ovid Kochavim purchases land in Eretz Yisrael, it is still chayiv in Trumas and Meisers, and therefore it would be midoraisa chayiv in Trumas and Meisers, and you wouldn't be able to separate it in order to be poter the tevel, which is poter midoraisa, the one that got mixed in with the chulin. V'avalei min achiyuv ala poter. Ikadam, those who say it was fakert, Omar Le, Reb Tarfon suggested, Lech kach min Ovid Kochavim, dafka go buy from the Ovid Kochavim, kasover yesh kini lo Ovid Kochavim Eretz Yisrael lafkia miyad Meiser, that when Ovid Kochavim buys land in Eretz Yisrael, it is no longer chayiv in Trumas and Meiseris, and therefore v'avalei min aptur al aptur, that he would be only chayiv to separate Trumas and Meiseris from this produce from the Ovid Kochavim midirabanan, because midoraisa it's not chayiv Trumas Meiser, so it would only be midorabanan. Midoraisa would be potter, as well as the teva, which got mixed in with the chulin, which would also be potter, and therefore you could separate from the produce you purchased from the Ovid Kochavim in order to be matir the tevel. V'leimalei kach me'ashuk. Why not buy from Ruvain, the famous Amaretz produce monger? Because ein rov Amaretz masin, that would not be a valid solution, because Reb Tarfon holds that most Amaretzes do not, in fact, separate Meiseris, and therefore it would be considered chayav midoraisa to separate Meiser, and therefore it would be on a chiyuv on a ptur also. Okay. Shalach le Rav Yemar bar Shlami le Rav Papa. Rav Yemar bar Shlami says to Rav Papa, Hada Amar Ravin bar Chinina, Amar Ula. That was Rav bar Chinina says Nim Vula Amar Chanina. Halacha Rab Shimon Shazuri, that the halacha is like Rab Shimon Shazuri v'lo order. Not only that, ela kol malkom sheshana Rab Shimon Shazuri halacha kamoso, that wherever Rab Shimon Shazuri comes up, the halacha is like him. Af ben esariv leitevel bechulin. Is it also in this case that we just read from this brisa that Rab Shimon Shazuri had a situation where the tevel got mixed together with the chulin, and Rab Tarfon had told him find something that's potter and then separate from the potter ala potter. Amalei in, and Rav Papa responds, yes, it applies there as well. Amr Vashi says, Vashi, Amrli Marzutra, the Marzutra told me, Kashi bar Reb Chanina Misura, the Reb Chanina Misura had a shtickle issue with this question of, shall we say that the statement that the halachas like Reb Shimon Shazuri applies to here as well, by the mixture of the tevel with the chulin? The question is problematic because Pshita, obviously it applies. Mikam Mishnah Senu, what was the statement? The statement was, right? Amr Rabbi Bachin, Amr Ula, Amr Bachanina, halacha Reb Shimon Shazuri, v'la'od ela kol makom sheshana Reb Shimon Shazuri, halacha kamoso. Wherever it is, whether it's a Mishnah, whether it didn't say only in the Mishnah, so what's the mean? Of course, the halacha is also like Reb Shimon Shazuri based on this brisa. It's always like Reb Shimon Shazuri. That was the whole statement. Chevra, with that we end. So we're mamish at the top here of Lamed Aleph on base. I just figured, Chevra, we just did so much. We just jumped around throughout several different starim in Shas, trying to figure out different, sometimes complex Mishnayos. I figured this was not the time to start jumping into, getting back into Sefer Torah. Let's start with Sefer Torah from a fresh start tomorrow. Friends, that was Daf Lamed Aleph of Masechta Menachos. So friends, on Daf Lamed Aleph, really, I'm not going to go into all the detail here, but basically we had one goal on Masechta Lamed Aleph, which was that we had a statement of Ravin in the name of Rab Chanina, in the name of Ula, in the name of Rab Chanina. Right, that Rav Bar Chanina said the name of Ula, the name of Rab Chanina, that the halacha is like Rab Shimon Shazuri, and also it's always like Rab Shimon Shazuri wherever he comes up. And the question was, we were trying to figure out where, in what context was that statement made. We had suggested all sorts of mishnayos, and until I think where we basically finally landed, we're on Rav Papa had suggested a mishnah from Kalim. Rav Nachman Yitzchak had suggested a mishnah from Tyrus. We seem to say that those were acceptable. Along the way, we learned several intricate and disparate, spread out mishnayos. I thought it was very interesting learning about all these random, detailed, in-depth kind of topics. I thought it was very interesting. I hope you did as well. Friends, enjoy your day. Have a great day. I'll catch you tomorrow. Cheers.